the weed element of this album to me seemed really pronounced compared to anything else that came out before it. Like, I remember DJ Quick had one song about it, and then besides that, you know, there was a few little sneaky references here and there, but it wasn't until this album, as far as I know, where a rap group would really just get behind weed smoking in such a big way.
Weed has always been such a huge part of hip hop anyway. But this was when it was kind of coming out into the open, you know? They kind of liberated everyone. You know, the biggest weed reference is right behind you, Jonah, this skull.
Funny enough, I was still young enough to where I was innocent enough to not pick up on what that was turned upside down. You know? It was interesting to kind of get an education at that age about weed smoking and whatnot, you know, because nobody was really leaning into it the way y'all were talking about until they did. And then it just opened the floodgates for people to embrace it.
I mean, you hear Dr. Dre prior to this album, I don't smoke weed or cess. And then 2 years later, The Chronic.
Exactly.
This was like kind of opening the door to the era of like a lot of weed smoking. And like when you're stoned, like slower beats sound better. You know, even though the beats on this album are pretty fast, after this, you know, the beats just get slower. And I think maybe weed made music slow down in the 90s.
Definitely had something to do with the weed, because that, as you move more into the mid 90s, the weed that people were smoking was called chocolate in New York. And it was much heavier, let me tell you. And that's where that head nod comes from, you know, head nodding beats. Because dudes are just like puffing on, chain smoking this blunts of chocolate.
It seemed like around this time, you know, you started to have more like really strong, good quality weed in general. As the 90s progressed, like the weed just got stronger and people got more stoned.
On the East Coast, we would get it from Jamaica. Okay, and it was like this. They used to hard pack it. It was like compressed. I've seen how it was smuggled. People used to smuggle it in like Congo drums and pack it in the side of the drums, and then you break the drum open.
We got a similar thing in California, but it was from Mexico. The cheap, hard-packed dirt weed full of stems and seeds.
But it was strong. It was strong, wasn't it?
Yeah, ours wasn't. Not that strong usually.
Yeah, we got the same stuff Jonah was getting, but ours wasn't too bad, you know.
And we were talking about the connection between the weed, stronger weed.
Weed.
Stoned is the way of the walk. Well,
This is a more weed tempoed track, probably the slowest track on the album.
I'm going to blame this song for eventually developing a weed habit. I heard this and I was like, I want to get high. I want to know what that's about.
Well, you know, I was a child of the 80s and staunchly opposed to drugs of all sorts. I watched those This Is Your Brain on Drugs commercials. And the first day that I heard this album in full was also the first day that I smoked weed. I was the only kid in my class besides the one other lower on the totem pole kid than me. Like, he was like the biggest nerd and I was like one step up from him. We were the only ones that didn't smoke weed. And I had this scheme. I was gonna smoke weed and then quit so that I could be an example to all the other kids and be able to preach that like drugs are bad. But it didn't work. Anyways.
You got hooked. Now look at you.
Yeah.
Look at your brain on drugs. Well, Cypress Hill will do it to you, man. If you're not smoking weed before, Cypress Hill will do it to you.
That was interesting too, like not being a weed smoker when Cypress Hill was rising and then becoming an adult and getting high and going back and listening to it. I think that's where I really started appreciating Muggs's production, getting older and hearing songs like this as I was getting high. It's like, damn, there's a whole nother world going on in this album that I've never really ever paid attention to.
There is something conducive to being stoned and listening to this album for the sonic qualities, which I'm not sure I can fully wrap my head around why, but maybe it's something to do with the dissonance, the kind of discordant elements and the noisy elements, that being in that kind of altered mind state, that foggy mind state, somehow allows you to vibe with that a little bit easier. I don't know.
Stoned.
Weed.
Weed.
Weed.